Glad to be here again.
Go.
Does anybody have any questions or anything? I'm sure we all saw the thing that happened in Connecticut yesterday.
Yeah.
Can I ask what you thought about that?
First reaction is a natural reaction that everybody has of why and all of that stuff. And how could someone, and all of that, do that?
Yeah.
This is Rania. I had a long conversation with my brother last night on this one. And spiritually it was easy to answer. Not easy, it was easier to, because that's how we talk, understand, and talk. He wanted to talk about it in the natural though, which was gun control. Whether or not it's needed. And I guess that was where I actually found it harder to talk about what was going on. Because I understand spiritually what's going on, but the natural outcome of that, I know what I think, but he had some valid points about not adding gun control at all. So I guess if I had a question at all, it would be where thoughts went there as well.
Well, my thoughts were that gun control doesn't matter. It's not going to change it because you got, over 200 million guns in this country already. It doesn't matter. My thoughts went to the whole idea of everything reaching ahead. There's nothing that that grabs your attention more than 26 kids. Had it been a college, it would have been a different reaction. Even in that mall, it was a different reaction. And with them happening so frequently, it's almost like the God of, we know that the manifestation of the God of this world is money, but the protector of that money is a gun. And now we're beginning to see that come to a head, where people begin to realize that you may have a gun, but it doesn't protect you. Because it wouldn't matter how many were in that school, it's not going to protect those kids. And so I don't think it's about gun control at all. I think it's about where our heads are in terms of the spiritual.
I too had a conversation with that young man last night, and we went to, this was at 2 a.m. We went.
He called you when he hung up with me. I told him to call his daddy.
His daddy was asleep. Anyway, this went to, we started talking about things like the fact that this is not the first time stuff like this has ever happened. There have been children dying all over the world in the thousands. It's just when it hits, quote unquote, home, that's when we pay attention to it. But there have been, in the time of Herod, in the time of Jesus' birth, children were put to death, and we forget to step back and put in perspective. And my reaction was the same as everyone else's. The tears, the how could this? But then I remembered that, okay, this is the natural. We're called to not just look at the natural. We've got to look behind it and see what's underneath. What's the spiritual meaning of it? And I think there were 20 children, not 26. 20 is the number for redemption. I think there were 6 adults.
Yes.
6 is the number of man's weakness.
Yeah.
This is. I didn't think about all this last night. I thought about all of this morning. But it's an opportunity and children represent thoughts, our thoughts, and so it just points to the opportunity for man to be redeemed from his weaknesses, his humanness.
A new beginning, 6 and 2 is 8.
And you can look at it that way as well. And then there was one other point I wanted to make. And then after I got off the phone with my son, because then he told me about dreams he had about his son just in the last 7 days. And we talked about that, and I could not respond, but I thought about it this morning, and I told him what I told Rainier one time. If you're having these dreams and they're waking you up, then go back and redream them. Go back and make it. He says, "Oh, I didn't think about that." I said, "Son, you will really know the power that's in you when you begin to do that. If we're co-creators and we create and we can give life to these negative things, then even more so because of who we really are, there has to be that balance. We have to be the one to think about what's the good that comes out of Connecticut? What's the good that comes out of Syria? So that we can counterbalance what's going on." So when he talked about his son falling off the cliff, they were in a mountain view, and the son fell off the cliff. And he said, his wife said, "Go get my son." You know?
Yeah.
Go get my son. He said, "Mom, I dove off the mountain." Yeah. And I don't know what happened after that. I just woke up in the cold chills.
Yeah.
But, you know, I got something to tell him now about what that could say. You know? But she kind of is reminding him, you got this in you.
Yeah.
It's not natural. So, anyway, it is an opportunity for us to examine our real selves, our authentic selves.
I almost called you this morning, Nick, to discuss this very thing. Then I thought, we're going to talk about it anyway and see how it relates to what we've been dealing with. So I don't think it's a coincidence by any means that it happened. Neither do I think it's a coincidence that no matter what happens, there's always the first order of discussion when we come together. So here we are.
Yeah, thank you for that, everybody. And I do think it is relevant because I can't remember anything of this magnitude happening before, and not in terms of amount of people, unfortunately. Welcome to America, but in terms of the people that were targeted and just the absolute craziness of it. So I think it will have the effect of, like, what else can you do? I don't want to know, but if you can walk into a school and do that to a bunch of children, like, what else is there? So I believe it will have the effect of making us, of bringing us to an edge, so to speak. And it's funny how the dream was about the cliff and everybody's talking about the physical cliff and all that. But I believe it has the biggest, one of the big things it will do is, even on a subconscious level, put something in us collectively that just says this has to stop. Because I mean, it there's nothing else. Like, it's just absolute insanity.
But Nick, I guess where I'm going is, and I guess that's part of what we're going to talk about 1221, our role in all of this. Because it has to be an active, and I don't mean necessarily out there protesting, I mean an active spiritual role as a counterbalance to use all of this light that's going to be diffused. It can't be just to say, oh, woe is us, and yeah, you know, this really was a bad thing. We know that. We feel for those folk like they were our own, but our role is to not only feel it, but to move through it and and redefine what it really means instead of what people think it means.
Right. I think we
Yeah.
I think we have to experience it. We have to live it. Because if you don't feel the plight of mankind, then you don't do anything about it. And when we talk about the gun control issue and the deep discussions about that, that's the only thing most people think that they can do about it. You know, when the greatest thing you can do about it is to make a conscious decision to be in rhythm with the Creator, so that you're not the one who's directing the change, because we don't really know what it should be, but we're being directed towards the change, or guided towards the change.
So you're saying we need to change the thoughts, the mindset of people in general, mankind in general.
We need to
Just
change
like
our
we-
own.
Well, yeah, our own.
Yeah.
And I know it starts with us, and it goes back to, like you said, that gun control is not,
The issue.
it's not the issue. It's our thoughts.
So when our thoughts are not what should be done, because we don't know. Our thoughts are, let thy will be done. Whatever you desire, Creator, let it be done. We are the vessels through which you can work. We're willing vessels, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And I believe the type of, it's, we've got a little bit to go over. Well, I plan to go over a little bit before we actually get to it, but it relates to, that verse about the elect not being deceived. In the quote unquote the end times or whatever. Because despite all the chaos that is going on around us, and we'll talk about this a little more, but the principle behind that is to remain aware of who you are and what our real responsibility is. So I believe things like this especially happen so that we can jump to some sort of action that doesn't necessarily deal with the actual issue. And the deception comes into play when we allow ourselves to forget our first responsibility, which is to remain true to who and what we are and be that. And get lost in some, not lost, but like get distracted or deceived by something that is external that is presented to us as a possible solution that isn't necessarily. So.
Nick, one of the other things I forgot to say is that after, it's about 3 o'clock when I hung up, but I couldn't go back to sleep. And then when I decided to look at the clock finally, and guess what the clock was on? 3:33 a.m.
You know, that happens
Yeah,
more often than I would like to admit.
yeah, it does.
And I could, yeah, it does. And it does mean something. And I've noticed a lot of stuff like that, and for a long time. And am I talking about that somewhere in there? No, we will. But all that is just like it's like a reminder.
Yeah.
It's have you ever heard the term synchronicity?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's becoming more and more popular, I think, or more and more widely used. But that's what that is. So it's just I wonder what time it is, and it's that certain time. That always has to do with those certain numbers, certain combinations of numbers. It's just a reminder as to where you are, or what track you are on, or whether or not you are responding to an influx of a particular energy or not. So, last week we had talked about a bunch of stuff. And this week we were talking about a bunch more stuff. So what I want to do now is, and I think I've mentioned this before a little bit, but walk us through the history of the development of how we think and how human thought has changed over time. And it definitely relates to what happened yesterday in Connecticut, and just all the things that our collective thought are the result, or what our collective thoughts result in terms of what we see going on. Anyway, so last week we talked more about the what was created as a result of the Creator imbuing us with the responsibility for our own situation. And then in the beginning, there were the beings known as the Elohim, which we are, and it was their original task to return or realize who and what they were in full, not through the use of only what they possessed at that time, but through discovering what was deep inside of them that connected them to their source, and allowing that source to move through them and determine what it is that they created as a result of that, or whatever it is that they did as a result of being aware of that source. So, in the beginning, because they had not yet fully completed that realization, or it was probably not even possible for them to do that without having to go through this process. So in the beginning, they did whatever they knew how to do, and they divided and subdivided and created more and more and more based on what they thought, what we thought we should do, as opposed to what the source of what we are told us to do. But it's not really about giving us rules and instructions necessarily. But so as a result of our tinkering, our experimenting with the abilities that we were given, we produced everything that we experience now. So when we look at history, we have to look at a couple different things. So far, we've been talking about the spiritual. And the spiritual relates to the physical because everything that happens in spirit is expressed in the physical. So when we look at in the beginning all the things that happened then, the then is actually a now, because those things are a continual process. They are set in place, and they don't move, if that makes any sense. So basically I'm saying they're continuous. They have not stopped. And they must be continuous because that is the whole process about how this physical experience continues to exist. So whatever happens in the spiritual is expressed in the physical. So in terms of our history, we can look back at the development of our own ways of thinking, our own thought, the transitions between different civilizations, and the knowledge and the culture that they produced, and look at where we were or are spiritually. So when we talk about the era of Adam and Eve. When we look at the physical, what's the word I'm looking for? The physical counterpart to that, in terms of what exactly it looked like, I can't say exactly, because I believe that era repeats itself to some extent, but we're basically talking about a time period in our history when we were closer to our source, or an awareness of who and what we are. And we produced a certain world because of that. And that world was pretty good, by all accounts. So, is everyone familiar with the term, or has heard maybe on History Channel, something called the Golden Age? So the Golden Age, or that term, comes from the Greek, and the Greeks got it from the Egyptians. But it refers to a time period in our history, in human history, when we weren't as crazy as we are now. When we walked, when we acted, when we thought, as a result of directly experiencing the source of who and what we were, without having to try to define it, without having to try to qualify it. We knew it because we were it. We still are it, we just chose to ignore it. So in this golden age, the first time, and yeah, I believe it was called Zet Tepi in Egyptian, or that might be the Greek translation of that word or something. But the first time is the beginning of that cycle that I mentioned before. So everything we are experiencing is cyclical, but it doesn't have to come around to the exact same spot. So instead of a cycle that's going around just flat, it's a cycle that's spiraling upwards, is a way to think about it. So the same things don't happen necessarily, but the same types of things happen. And they appear different based on whatever era we're in. So at the beginning of this era, at the beginning of this cycle, that's where I want to start in terms of explaining how all this stuff relates together. So for that purpose, in the beginning refers to the beginning of this cycle. So when we look at the Bible and all the stuff that happened in Genesis, it can refer to the beginning of this current cycle. Even though it doesn't refer to only this cycle, it refers to all of them at all times because the same process takes place, if that makes sense. And in every cycle, understanding that process leads you back to the same place, which is the beginning and the space that beginning provides, and then what came before. Any questions? Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, talk about cycles. This is where we start talking about how we measure time, and how different cultures measure time everywhere. So, time is a linear thing. Time that is viewed or thought of as something that has an ultimate beginning and an ultimate end is kind of a Western thing. And there's a part of the reason that is a Western thing is because how people in the West think, and how the way in which people thought changed and developed over time as we moved out of our places of origin and explored the world and stuff like that. It is all related to this whole process of the great task, which is to know yourself. It's all related to how that whole process plays out over time or within each cycle. So in the beginning, or close to the beginning of this cycle, it was known as the Golden Age. And I forget the exact person or the exact Greek person to sort of popularize that term, but it refers to a time when human beings were closer anyway to the knowledge of who what they were, and they used all the abilities and took advantage of all the responsibilities that we had as a result of that knowledge. And we were supremely intelligent and powerful, essentially. And that is actually closer to our true state. So in the New Testament, when it says, "Ye are gods," there are time periods in history where we were. And in the sense that we had all the abilities and we had all the abilities that we would typically consider a god to have. So does that make sense?
Yes.
So obviously, we're not at that same point anymore. So something happened between then and now within this cycle, like it happens in every cycle. And what happened was we fell out of the awareness of who and what we were, the more complete awareness of who and what we were, and fell asleep, became ignorant, lazy, unresponsible, all that stuff. Now, there is a secret to why that was even allowed to happen, but we'll get to that. All of it is part of the process. It's a rough process, but it's something that we have to go through. It is how it works. And we can fight it, or we can use it to propel us forward into the beginning, or back to the beginning and what came before it, so that we don't have to get caught up in the cycle again. So the cycles of time, or the history repeating itself, and all that, happens so that we can always have the opportunity to complete what it is we're here for. Always. So it doesn't matter. If this planet blows up one day and a trillion years pass, this will happen again. And it's all in service of the ultimate purpose of life itself. Anyway. So, in the beginning, or towards the beginning of this cycle, I need to add something else. I mentioned that the only way we measure time, or even recognize that there are cycles, is cosmic, to measure time. And in the beginning, the measurement of time wasn't even a thing that we did until we began to look up at the stars and see them changing. Until we began to look up at the sky and notice it and see it changing. So when we see the sun go over, when we see the moon go over, when we see the moon disappear and come back, disappear and come back, when we see the stars move, that is where all this circular motion comes from. That is where our whole understanding of these cycles come from. And everything moves in a circle. Including us, which is why DNA is spiraled. But anyway. So, in the beginning, we got all of our knowledge from the stars. So when we look out into space, you are seeing the physical version of energies or spiritual entities, or whatever that best describe them, as they are present in the physical dimension. And the light coming from them that hits us and hits the earth is the physical experience of the light that is coming from these spiritual principles that encourage evolution, that encourage growth, that trigger all this stuff. So this whole process is really us responding to the influx of energy. And we have responded to it in different ways, depending at what point we are in the cycle. So everything we see that is physical is the physical experience of a spiritual concept, of an energy source. So, does that make sense? So, when we look at the stars and we look at the cycles, that's when we were the first people to record history. So history was recorded before we started to write it down. I know the actual academic definition of history is as soon as we started to write stuff down, but we were recording things, oral histories, long before we started to write. And actually, mentioned that in times that were closer to the beginning, or in the times when we were more naturally aware of what we were, we didn't write anything down.
Are we missing something?
He's just breaking up a little bit. It should correct itself in a minute.
You hear me okay?
A little better.
You're breaking up a little bit.
Okay. Let me know and I can hang up and come back or something. So, as I was just saying, we didn't need to write it because our memories were not clogged full of the junk that fills them now. And our memory was, we couldn't even imagine how good it was. And not just like, I remember images or I remember sounds. I remember perfectly every experience that I have just had. We call that holographic.
One more time, Nick.
Holographic.
It's not, our memory was unimaginably good. And we would call it holographic memory. Fully experience everything in your memory that you had experienced. So, we didn't write anything down, we did not need to. And in the times of beginning, all of our abilities were greatly enhanced. So we have all the same capabilities now. It just takes a lot of to use them consciously. In times of the beginning of the cycle, it didn't take as much work because we were just being naturally who and what we were. We were born with it and we didn't stamp it out in the children. And weren't necessarily had the experience of insanity, which is what we're going through now. We were responding to it naturally. We just because we were told to by our source. Just knew. And just to skip ahead a little bit, part of the reason we fell out of it is that we could learn to heal ourselves of our own insanity and learn how to use it consciously again. Because if you can heal yourself of your own insanity, there's no reason for you to ever go insane again. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's part of the behind why this needs to take place anyway. In the beginning,
So are you saying people don't want to be healed of their insanity?
no, but that's what we have to learn how to do. Position healed and all same.
You're breaking up a lot.
Can I have a call?
Yeah, we'll call you back.
Hello?
Hi.
The subject is
Do I sound better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So what I was just saying is, in the beginning, we operated out of a natural sense of who and what we were, that we possessed because of the energetic atmosphere of that time. So it's all about how energies that are coming into the earth, for lack of a better way to describe that, are influencing us on a collective, on a common level. But in the beginning, or at the beginning of the cycle, the energies were very, very easy to work with, and they promoted all of our abilities to know who and what we were, and then operate from that knowledge. So at the beginning of the cycle, that's where, and just like in the Greek, we get the term Golden Age, and that comes from the Egyptians. That's where we get Atlantis from. So, and whatever anybody thinks about that, who hasn't done any real, or hasn't felt it necessary to do any reading or anything about it, what that represented in that time period, which was a real time period, was what we were able to produce as a result of being in that knowledge of who and what we were. But obviously, the other big part of the story of Atlantis is it destroyed itself. And that is just part of the whole process of us doing that to ourselves on a global level. So that was kind of the fall out of that state of awareness of who and what we were, and into another kind of awareness.
Nick,
Yep.
was that the most recent fall or the fall? Our fall? Like, I'm just kind of curious with the cycles that we're talking about what that means.
Yeah, and that's a good question, and it's complicated to get into because it happens again and again and again and again and again. Only the degree of it is different. The way in which it manifests is different, but it's the same principle. So in terms of our history, the beginning of the cycle, yes, that was like the big one that initiated all of this.
Okay.
What we experience as the world today.
Okay.
But when we talk about the fall, we're talking about the fall in the ultimate sense. It happens every time you think a thought. At all levels does this play out. And it happens on the physical level, on a
But Nick,
global level.
Nick,
And that's kind of what we're talking about now. Yeah.
when you talk about the fall and the unawareness of who we are, that is not necessarily experienced by all of mankind, because I was thinking about the Dogon, who still are connected to who they are and realize, talk about how they came from another planet, and they knew that Cyrus was a twin planet before the astronomers found out about it just couple years ago. So are we talking about a fall in different segments of mankind?
That has to be true, because there are people who still remember that and still try to operate from that level.
So the Golden Age was a period in which more of the masses operated out of who they genuinely were, not just a sect of people. Is that what you're saying?
Right. It was very important to bring that up. Thank you. Because I just hadn't even thought to think that. But it basically means that the responsibility for the state of the world is always on the people who are seeking to know themselves consciously and be who they are. Because most people are not yet at the point where they realize the need to do that consciously. And people who are not yet at the point where they need to do it consciously are most susceptible to influences coming from outside of them. So when the atmosphere of energy changes, it's more likely that they will respond to that energy change in a particular way, or in a more extreme way. So those of us who are seeking to know who and what we are in a conscious way and consciously reconnect with our own source also experience those changes as the energy changes. But we don't necessarily, hopefully, we don't get distracted as much. Because the job of the elect is to not get distracted, as I was just mentioning. So, beginning with Atlantis, I guess, in this cycle, the masses, quote unquote, are going through this process whereby they are responding to the way energy is changing them. Or actually, I'll say reacting. So they weren't yet consciously responding, which is what we are learning how to do today. And as a global society, they were reacting to a change that they didn't necessarily know where it was coming from or what its ultimate purpose was. But anyway, so starting with the fall of that era, and all the little smaller falls that we've experienced since then, we have progressed or digressed or one of those two, depending on how you look at it. Like, from the state of being the gods that we were initially created as, to something that is a far cry from what we have the ability to be. So this is actually the end result, not the end result, but this is the almost the fullest expression of the initial impurities that were still present in us in the beginning. So remember last week or any other time where we talked about how we created out of our own intelligence, we created what we thought was good, rather than allowing the source to move through us and create us. Because of those initial impurities, we wanted to do it our way. We created in whatever way we thought was best. Unfortunately, it wasn't perfect. And at the beginning of the cycle, even if there was a little bit of impurity present, as time goes on, as you move further and further away from that, the effects of that tiny little impurity at the beginning begin to build on top of themselves.
So,
And apparently it gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
so relating that to 1221, desire has to be pure, or desire has to be open-ended, maybe I should say, as opposed to naming what we desire. It just has to be open-ended, which leads me to believe that everyone who comes together on the 21st has to come together for one goal and one goal only, and that is pure thought, pure desire. Is that what you're saying? I think Mark has something.
No, I agree completely. So, does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone? I can explain that some.
The thing as you were talking that I wrote down, which is what you asked the question about, was okay, if we have the responsibility, the thing that you that caught me was when you said the job of the elect is to not get distracted. So if we've got that responsibility not to get distracted, then what I wrote down was we need to create the environment in which the energy source can be the environment being the wombs of our thoughts, in which the energy source can create what it will, which is being open. Creating the environment means that we get rid of extraneous thoughts and focus and concentrate on just receiving what our source has for us. Not getting distracted and defining external things like this Connecticut thing as doom and gloom. I mean, we've got to consciously focus on. It's almost like a ground that needs to be tilled and it needs to be ready for seed planting, and there's some preparation that you do in order to make that happen. And regardless of what quote unquote weather looks like, we know that this is the season of planting, and so we have to prepare to receive the seed, in a sense.
So we are, based on what you're saying, we become the counterbalance to the doom and gloom. Because, the one that I was, as you were speaking, I thought back to the Hopi prophecy, where one of the lines was jagged at the end, and the other one parallel was continuous. And I listened to the narrators. They talked about that they focus on the jagged line, which the hope it says is the end. Not end in terms of cataclysmic things, but in terms of man's opportunity to change his focus.
In this age.
In this age, right, in this age. And the other line was a continuous one, which is peace. So our rhythm has to be, well, we must be in rhythm rather, with the Creator in order for us not to get distracted, being the very left. So the focus is not the survivalist thing and the doom and gloom. The focus is to peace. For like, you know.
Because the survivalist thing is a natural response.
Right. Yeah.
Not only that, but the survivalist thing is to continue when Nick was speaking earlier about we created what we wanted to create it and not necessarily what the Creator wanted us to create. So that will be a continuation of what we did to basically fall to begin with.
The survivalist thing is based on fear of gloom and doom, whereas we need to be based on fear of the awesomeness of our source and the endlessness of our source, which is a reverent type of fear. So the word fear is the same,
Yeah.
but it's how you define it, which makes the world, quote unquote, of difference.
Yes. So, and that's what we're trying to learn how to do on a collective level. And it starts with the people. Oh, what do you say, Rainy?
So raising my hand.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I want to go back to where you talked about this is a cycle that has, it continues to come around, where we reset almost. And it sometimes, depending on the purity of our desire, it's like an angle. If it's off just a little bit at the beginning, by the time it reaches the next place, it'll be way off because the angle is off. I guess I'm still very linear in my thoughts here, because is it always going to be a cycle? Are we always going to reset? Or is there a goal where we don't reset anymore?
There is a place where we, as individuals and as a group, however large that group is, don't have to reset anymore. The cycle is always there to catch anyone who has not yet come into the full awareness of who and what they are. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's like a structure that's set up to keep the whole process moving. And it will be there as long as it needs to be there, for whomever it needs to be there for.
It's like every route always leads back to beginning, ultimately. No matter which way or which direction you decide to go, I guess kind of like in a maze, it's going to end up at the same point, or that's the same point it's taking you there, but you just choose to get off route. But ultimately, you're still going back to the same place.
Is that not the idea of deliverance? For it is not God's will that any be lost, but all be saved.
Yeah.
So even if it for one person, the cycle will continue until it gets to a point where everyone is at beginning in terms of all their desires.
That's the one sheet too.
Right. Yeah.
Wait, but if everyone can get there, then there is an ending, right?
See, we think of ending in terms of time.
Yeah.
But the end of what we have even been able to measure is just an experience. The experience does not end. Our understanding of it as a physical experience is the only reason we even think of an end, quote unquote. But beyond that, it's just the next step.
When we get there, because time is a boundary, once we get there, you won't even think of ending or beginning. It just will be what it is.
Because there is no concept of end
Right.
in Eastern thought anyway. I mean, even when we look at the scriptures, it's not an ending in terms of how we, in Western thought, thinks that ending is the conclusion of something.
Yeah, it's just how you focus on a thing. So it's the same things. Okay, we're coming up on, for example, a new year, and we have those, every 365, 60, 5 1/4 days. So you look at it and you say, okay, you can look at it and say the year, is ending, or you can look at it as, okay, this is a continuous cycle, and it's just going to continue in another year. So the same exact thing is actually taking place. It's just you're looking at it from a different standpoint. And the same thing with the caterpillar and the butterfly. You can say that the caterpillar is dying, or you can just say that the caterpillar is just transferring into a butterfly. But it's just a continuum. Excuse me.
Yep. Can everybody see the screen I just put up?
Second.
Can everyone see the screen I just put up and
Yes.
what I just drew?
Yes.
Okay, and Rania, I just drew the Hebrew letter Samek. So it's the letter Samek, as we know, all the letters are talking about principles or functions of consciousness, and what they are able to create in terms of our experience. The letter Samek, it means like prop. Oh wait, is that Samek? I think that's it. Prop, or like tent peg or something. Or support is the important part to take away from that. So it supports the structure, if that makes sense. So even when you look at the letter, it is exactly what we were just talking about. It is a cycle with a hidden exit and entry point. So here we are down in the cycle, wandering around, like wondering what we're supposed to be doing, getting tossed and turned on whatever influx of energy happens to be the strongest at that point. And we are searching for the way out, which is the little piece up at the top. So this is always going to be here, that cyclical, the body of the letter, as long as it needs to be there for whoever. But the path out is hidden because it's found in our own connection to our own source. And this is the narrow, unused path. That's what this is a representation of.
Hey Nick, isn't it like a rat on a wheel? You keep going and eventually he just gets off? And that exit way is just getting off the wheel? Or that's something different? I'm looking at it differently.
Can you say that again?
I said, isn't it like a rat on a wheel? And the exit is, all he has to do is just get off. But he has to come to the realization that he's got, I can just get off this wheel. Is that the same thing you're talking about?
Yeah, it kind of is. Because we'll keep running until we get tired of it, and when we get tired of it, we begin to start asking questions.
Yeah.
And then we can begin to unlock, the secret to why we were even running on the thing in the first place, and then begin to search for a way out.
Yeah.
So
That's religion. I mean, we stay silent much too long. When we began asking questions, That's when we began to move from the trellises, the wheel that you were talking about.
Yeah, so I hope that kind of makes sense. Because what December 21st is that another point in the cycle. And is a very, very important point in the whole cycle. Anyway. So, has anyone heard of, and well, let me just say this, the many different great spiritual traditions had and still have this concept of the great cycle. So humanity goes through different eras of its own history. Some of them are much better than others. In Hinduism, it's called the Yuga cycle. The Egyptians had it, Greeks had it, which we just mentioned. It's present in others as well. So everybody is based on the same thing. So even though all these things look different, all these different external religions or whatever, they're all based on the same innate knowledge that we possess. And all of the mystical components of those religions are more direct about this. And they are much more similar than the mainstream stuff that we see on TV or whatever. Yep.
The Lakota Native Americans, one of the things they said was that their traditions began to decline when they stopped living in a circle. When they were put in square houses as opposed to the round teepees or structures that they lived in. Their village, everything was set up in a circle. And when they broke the circle, that's when they said that they began to lose any sense of their tradition or who they are.
Yep. Because when you break the circle, you change the energy.
Yeah.
And when you change the energy, if you yourself have not gone through this process internally and reconnected consciously to where you've come from, it's very easy to get distracted and full of all of the stuff that comes with the change. And that's what's happening, or that has happened on a world level. Because we have not, on a world level anyway, learned how to consciously cut through that crap, we are still being affected by it. Now, there are people who have, to some degree, never lost it. And it is our responsibility to make sure it doesn't get lost. And as long as we remain true to who and what we are, who and what we are, it will never be. But there always have to be some group of people in the earth who are able to relay this information. And they have to try to keep as much of it from the time of beginning as they can, so that there's a connection between those two states that we existed in. Because that's how they transfer energy back and forth, so that they can be influenced by each other, so that they can learn from each other. So we're talking about now stuff that was known widely and available freely, 25,000 years ago. And I mentioned that time, or that number anyway, 25,000, and I forget the exact number, but it's 25,900 to 600 years. That number keeps popping up because that's related to the precession of stars in the sky. So all it is just another cycle that is present that you can observe. when we look at the position of stars in the sky, remember I mentioned that's how we first began measuring time. This just happens to be the longest one that is available to us to see. And that's why it represents the great cycle, the whatever era we happen to be in. This is like the longest measurement of time that is available to us to see, so that we can use it to even measure time at all. And it takes 25,000 something years for that whole cycle to complete. So it goes very, very slowly. When we look at everything about our history related to how we view the stars, how we view the planets, know that all of that was started because we knew that what we were looking at was a physical representation of a spiritual concept and principle that exists within us as something in us that is closer to our own source. So everything that you're looking at on the outside of you is like whatever is inside of you flipped inside out. So if it looks further away from you physically, that's because it's deeper inside of you than just our normal conscious awareness. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That makes sense.
So in terms of our own experience, it takes more work to get to that place, that awareness inside of us. Just like it looks like it takes more work to get to that faraway place outside of us.
I got a question, and
Yes.
I don't know if everybody feel this way, and it may be off the lesson, but it seems like I'm outnumbered, not far as people, but with the thoughts that I have, with the people that I come in contact with on a daily basis. I don't know how to express.
So it feels chaotic or something?
Well, it just feel like I don't know how to explain it.
Like you're the only one sometimes,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And it's just like walking around with all of these. It's just weird. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Get his hand up.
It's like
We're just about to acknowledge him and say,
I wait on Nick to say you are. It's like, yeah, I ride on the highway and I think about how in the world can we influence all these people just on this highway? You know, not even thinking about it for a while. But then I have to remind myself that that's finite. You know, we are not talking about numbers of people. We're talking about thought, period. And when I'm reminded that the objective is to make sure it's in the macro, then it's picked up in the micro. So it's not about how many people around you as much as it is about how you perceive yourself. A couple of nights ago, I saw the Earth and all the planets, and I was there. And between one of the planets and the Earth came this red dot line, a lot of energy, and it looked like the tail of it stretched to infinity. So, but the point of it is, it means something, but I'm not going to get into that right now. My point is this: I saw myself as being much larger than the universe. You see?
Yes.
So when you look at it in terms of numbers of people, keep in mind that all of us are one. So it's just broken into different thoughts. That's all it is. But you have many thoughts in you.
Yes.
That, you know, there are times when you allow them to overwhelm you,
Yeah.
but you put it back in check. So the number of people on Earth is not an overwhelming thing unless we allow it to be.
And I do have to be mindful of that, because sometimes, and you're right, the thoughts do overwhelm me, and it's like you have to sit in your cubicle and keep your mouth shut, because the minute you say something, you know, it's like, again, you outnumber. So the best thing to do is to keep your mouth shut unless it's for you to, you know, if you feel that you need to say something. So I just wanted to express that, that's all.
Yeah, one of the things that we've talked about in the past is that as light infuses this consciousness, it also exposes darkness, and so that's another way to look at the Connecticut kind of thing. It's just, you know, it's right out there for everybody to see. What's happening in Syria is right out there for everybody. What's happening in Africa with genocide and people and children are dying is right out there for everybody to see. Whereas in another period of time, we might not have paid as much attention or not known about it. But there's so much technology, whatever, is available to us that who knows? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if after 2012, even greater darkness is exposed.
Oh, you probably will.
But that's it's the age for us not to be distracted, but to keep the focus, and to keep that. It's almost like I don't know, for lack of a better word, this laser on truth. To keep it in our consciousness.
Yep, and that is it's difficult for us to do because we have this like almost we're addicted to trapping thought and defining it, and we're trying to rid ourselves of this addiction, and that's a difficult thing to do.
We're addicted to trapping thoughts and what?
Defining it.
And
And
defining
attempting
them.
to define them,
Okay,
to
that's
make them into something that we
that's
think
a
they
good
should be,
remembrance
out of our
phrase.
ignorance of what they actually are. So if thoughts produce physical reality, our attempts at defining thought and defining what Source was trying to speak to us is the result for all the negativity that we see. Out of our own selfishness or egotistical or whatever. And it's not like, it's really just out of our own attempts to do good. We ended up not doing so good. But that's okay because, child, you have to learn from your mistakes. I will allow you to learn from your mistakes because that is how you actually learn.
As Pastor has often said, out of the Azusa Street revival, people tried to capture it and write books about it, and instead of letting it go, they tried to capture it and make money off of it, basically, and which is where it went wrong.
So we put, you see when we inject into it, we put all this junk in it.
That's the impurity. That's it. There's an opportunity to see something purely, a pure thought. And the injection, that's the impurity that was injected into it, trying to mold it and shape it into our likeness, our image and likeness.
And that pure thought, that pure desire that we were just talking about is difficult to just let it be. Because we always try to shape it and mold it into something or a desire for something. Anytime you have the word thing, you're talking about something that has been molded by our intelligence. And the whole point is, what you consider, or however you consider yourself to be intelligent, you just fail. But it's not who you are, it's what you think you are now, that you are operating from. So in order to operate from who and what you actually are, don't try to do anything to it. Maintain a state, an internal state, that allows it to do to you. making sense? We are trying not to create something out of our own sense of what should be. We are trying to allow what is to recreate us. So there is a give and take between our own sense of the need to do something with it and what it is actually speaking to us. So the more we resist our own urge to trap it, to put something on it, the more we will be able to actually operate in line with it.
That's the most difficult thing. To just be and to allow what is to be what it is, because we have been indoctrinated with the whole concept of being able to fix things, figure out what, how to do it. You're supposed to be self-sufficient, that kind of thing. You're supposed to be able to reason through anything that occurs in your life and bring it to a conclusion that's suitable to you, as opposed to allowing it to flow like a river, unimpeded.
The whole idea of self-sufficient, it sounds like separation in a nutshell. The idea that you can be completely disconnected from everything outside of yourself and be just fine.
Yeah, and that's the whole
That's a lie.
It's a lie, but it's a lie we've been living and we've been teaching.
Well, that's the insanity, right?
That's the insanity, that we're self-sufficient.
So, and I know this is difficult to try to think about, but essentially we're just trying to get out of our own way
Yeah.
and allow the deeper parts of who what we are to influence our ability to respond to whatever situation. So, closer to the beginning of this cycle, of this era, people did that more naturally. It wasn't perfect, but it was a heck of a lot better than we do it now. This is, just because we're familiar with it, this is the time period in terms of our physical history of Atlantis. It's the time period of the Great Pyramid. Is the time period of the Sphinx. All that stuff that we built was a result of an awareness that we existed in. But anyway, so in, or closer to the beginning of this, energy or light that was coming into us through our own inspiration followed a certain channel. It still follows those certain channels, it's just that we have forgotten how to focus on where it comes from. So when you think a thought, and then it results in an action or whatever, it follows a certain path in order to become a physical thing. So if we are more aligned with the natural way energy flows, then everything's good. When we introduce more changing directions and more obstacles, things begin to get disrupted. So, at the beginning of the era, we were very much more so in line with the natural flow. And related to what I just tied together with thinking, the difficulties we have now with trying to hear that still small voice, they didn't really have those difficulties, or much less. So they were aware of the process of inspiration, which is how you think. At a deep level, something sparks, and then it goes through its channels to produce thought, which then produces action. But the very first point, just like that point source of light we've been talking about in the beginning, is energy from the source of who and what you are. So, and I'll put up something on the screen in a second, but that energy comes through the middle. In other words, that energy comes through at a place of balance between the different aspects of yourself. And it always has to do that. So whether or not we are resting in that place of balance in us is a different story. But that energy always comes through the middle. And this is where in Buddhism, you get the term the middle path. If you've heard of that before. Essentially, it is saying this is how you have to balance yourself if you want to be aware of who and what you actually are. All these things have to be in balance.
It's like the
It is
structure.
also the middle of the tree of life, that Kabbalistic tree of life, which I guess is still in the room somewhere.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, everything starts in the middle. Did somebody have a question?
I was gonna say that, but you,
Oh, okay.
She didn't raise her hand.
no, because of the light infusion, you already picked up on it and put it out there.
So I'm gonna switch over and start to draw some stuff. Quick. It'll make it a bit easier to see. Can everyone see my screen? And I'll describe it for those of you who can't, who are connected. So, put up my everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So, where's my brain at? There we go. So I just put up a brain on the screen to sort of show you, in terms of how this plays out physically, how this energy actually comes in. So I know I've talked about, or a little bit about, the difference between the right half and the left half of our brain. Closer to the beginning of this era, of this cycle, and I'll try to make that a bit bigger, actually. People operated from a place that was much more balanced and in the center. So that diagram that I drew with the circle and the dot in the middle,
Yeah.
that's the initial point source of light that enters the physical space. And remember, that is also the symbol of the sun. And this also represents the pineal gland, which is related to the sun in your own head, because it's where the light shines from.
Well, that's interesting because the Chinese say that that's where you take the energy. Right there in that spot in your head where it's kind of indented.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the soft spot in the top of your head,
Yeah.
the line of energy comes in and out.
And in Thailand, you never pat a kid on top of his head.
Yeah.
Isn't that one of
All
the
of
chakras
those
too,
things
like
too.
the crown?
That,
Yeah.
Well, it's, you just put it here or there, it's the same.
Dad, you feeling okay?
Who?
You
Dad,
feeling okay?
you.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah. Why?
Oh, you haven't said anything yet.
I just,
He just walked in.
2
Oh,
seconds ago.
I had a driveway sale not.
oh, I'm sorry.
Well, it's all your junk.
Anyway. So,
We'll fix that at Christmas.
we operate out of, well, mostly, out of different aspects of who and what we are, depending on our own awareness of who and what we are. So in the beginning, their awareness was more so, or was closer to the source of who and what they are. It was balanced in terms of the different aspects of themselves. And because of that balance, they were more aware of that initial influx of energy, of light. So that's why the pineal gland sits in the middle of your head. Because it operates the best when both of these aspects are balanced. And I'll draw the tree of life over here.
Draw circles. You laugh.
Those are hard.
Kids today can't draw anything.
I can't draw circles.
Yes, you can. If you
Not
let
well.
yourself.
You know what it looks like.
If you let yourself.
Okay. So, at the initial point source, that's like where the light is coming in from originally. So that would be up here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So then, it goes to the right in the tree of life diagram, which is over here at wisdom. In your own head, this energy goes, or it connects more with the right brain first, which is the creative, feminine, and what we usually think of, part of yourself. This more easily connects with the initial point source of light because it has not yet been defined as much. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yep.
So then it goes to the left. Now there is understanding. And then it comes over to the analytical, logical, male part. In terms of our physical head, anyway. So does that make sense?
Yes.
So this is the initial process. And the balance that we actually have to bring to ourselves in order to best understand how all these things relate takes place in these lower seven. So here's your head at the top, and there's your body down below. that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So, and it's not just referring to your body that's physically below your head, but it's referring to that vessel as a whole. So you and your ability to actually use this light. So, in the beginning, at the beginning of the era, people were much more balanced between these two, and because of that, they could do things that we would consider to be godlike. And that we even see it today, occasionally. Savants and people who have this incredible ability to do stuff and think are sort of like remnants of what we could do. But the problem is so much chaos has been introduced that people who are born with that usually can't handle anything else. So they might not be able to tie their shoes correctly, but they can multiply 10-digit numbers in a second.
Nick, do you have is there anything out there, any sense of why, I think I'm right, if you're going to use Savant, most often that the evidence of that ability is demonstrated through math. Most savants can add very complex numbers very quickly. Or music. Okay, music is an extension of math. Music is very mathematical.
Also art.
Art, really?
There's one who there's a guy who's out there who flew all over Rome and then could
I saw that.
precisely
Yeah.
recreate everything.
Okay, I'm distinguishing a little bit between what we usually call savant and somebody who might be clairvoyant or
No, this is not.
out of body like. Okay.
And I just use that word savant, but it's all part of the same spectrum, I guess you say. But yeah, actually, when you mention the math and the music, those two are very much related. So music is like right brain math, and math is in and of itself left brain math.
Left brain music.
And that's kind of how they relate, but there's a lot of gray area in your gray matter.
That's why it's great.
Because math, as we just talked about last time, is numbers, is relationships. Because numbers they're just arbitrary. Numbers in and of themselves don't describe anything. They just are numbers. We apply them to our experience, but we don't necessarily have to. So we can just do math that is abstract, that is not necessarily connected to actual numbers of things in front of us, right? So we're really just talking about relationships between concepts, which also ties in geometry. And I'll get to more about geometry specifically, but all of this is an ability to quickly understand how things relate to each other. And math is it's easy to do with math because the rules are very simple. Now, mathematics is actually simpler to do than tying your shoes. It's much simpler. Now, we don't usually think of it that way because, math is so difficult, but
Yeah.
when you do something as simple as pick up a pencil off the table, you are triggering all kinds of subconscious processes that allow you to control and manipulate your arms. But math is, by comparison, a lot easier. We just are operating out of an innate sense or an innate knowledge of how to do that when we operate our bodies and do stuff that we would consider easy, like be social. But somebody who is autistic, somebody who is a savant, are geniuses in one specific thing, and usually the easiest thing to get. But does that make sense? And I know I don't mean to like belittle that ability. Like, if it was easy, we could do it. It's hard, but I think you get what I'm saying.
Yes.
Okay.
So easy we can't.
Yep. So, at the beginning of the era that we find ourselves to be apparently nearing the end of, people had much greater conscious, free access to these abilities because they were balanced in themselves. So, as time went by, we eventually began the seat of our awareness, or where we rested in ourselves, began to shift its position. And over here on the left of the tree of life, it began to go all the way down. So when we look at different civilizations, when we look at cultures around the world, when they begin to affect change on a global level, it's always because they are like the next step in this whole process of coming all the way down to where there's nowhere else to go, really. And again, just like Pastor Rich said, everyone doesn't go everywhere at the same time. There are still people who are operating up here and here and here and all these other places in terms of where they are in themselves. But at the beginning of the era, there was nobody who was like down in the lower levels to the same degree that we are today. So this was a new thing that was produced in this era.
I have a question.
Now, the majority of people are somewhere in the body, but the original connection to the source has never been truly lost, nor could it be. Somebody had a question, sorry? Go ahead.
I did. I had to raise my hand. But don't we all go up and down? Like the picture, like the tree of, the tree? Don't we all go up and down at times? Meaning as far as consciousness? Because you were saying that there's people that stay up there, but don't we all go up and down at times? Just some go not remain, but stays up there a little longer than others? Or, because I'm thinking if that's the case, if you stay up there, we'd be like Enoch and all the other guys. Well, there's only two that I know of, Enoch and Elijah, right?
Yeah, you're right. If we had never left, we would still be like Adam, or I would say Adam and Eve. What that represents. Because Enoch and Elijah were steps towards healing this insanity. And I hope that makes sense. But what I'm trying to say is that if we had not fallen, or quote unquote fallen, we would still be we would still be like Enoch and Elijah in terms of the fantastic things that we read about them doing. But what I'm actually saying is what those two represented was actually a step beyond that.
Okay.
No, fight for your point. I think what Evelyn meant, if I can, is that at any given moment, and maybe in our confusion, we don't recognize it so much, but there are moments of quiet, there are moments of epiphany, there are moments that pass through you or you pass through, but the point is we've lost a sense of discipline or whatever to stay connected to those as opposed to the others. But so you're more like truth bouncing around inside something, and at one moment or another, you're experiencing it, but you don't grasp it, you don't stay connected, that kind of thing. I think, isn't that what you meant?
Well, that's, yeah.
And if it's all still in us, if all that ability is still there, it's we can't access it on purposefully because of the lack of clarity, focus, connection, whatever terms I guess you want to say.
Yeah, that's basically.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
I
how
would-
do you get back to that? Otherwise, you have to create something new, and the point is, there's nothing new to create.
But see, I think the point goes both ways. It's a fluctuation, but not to the point of crown. We don't get to that point of crown. We get close to it in terms of the enlightenment or the epiphanies that we have, but we don't get the crown. And and another point I wanted to make, Nick, is this: that when we look at indigenous people, the infection that we take in is not just physical. We infect them by trying to make them what we call modern, and actually removing them or disconnecting them from what they really know and who they really are. So I think it's more of a fluctuation in terms of Elvin's point, but not too not above.
Yeah, and I think I understand what you mean, and yeah, I definitely agree. So when you say we go up and down, it's kind of like we bounce around between these.
Yeah.
So.
I don't really. I mean, how is it? You don't ever have a moment of just awesome clarity, and maybe it doesn't last long, or as soon as you identify it, it's gone, sort of thing. Wouldn't that be breaking through that sort of ceiling, if you want to call it that, or that barrier? Even if you can't articulate, or you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and actually, I would agree. That happens very, very, very rarely. So most of the time we're kind of below that experience or not in that experience, but yeah, I think that does happen. So you could draw another arrow going back and forth, kind of. And actually, I'll put that over here. So with that representation anyway, the tree of life diagram, we are learning how to balance ourselves so that we can best understand the selves that we actually are. So, up here at the top is that initial point source. And then down below is how that point source becomes jumbled up to produce whatever physical experience we have. So it's kind of our responsibility to learn how to piece the correct path back together so that this energy can come through properly. And implant itself fully down here in the physical. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well,
So I hope I haven't gotten off topic or lost anyone, but in the beginning, or in the beginning of the era, this was much easier to do. So what the physical realm, or what the world looked like, was much more in line with what we think of when we think of our head or something like that. In terms of what the world looked like, how it worked, and also how we were able to operate in it. Now, because in the beginning, though, it wasn't perfect, as it says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't perfect, so there was still some amount of impurity that over time began to build on itself and introduce more chaos into our experience.
Nick,
Yeah.
explain the perfect, because I know it's not the perfect that we think it is. Or is it? When you say be ye perfect,
Right. No, it is not the perfect that we can see. Even in saying that term, we try to like define what that could be. And as we do that, like just what we talked about, we try to own it and put it in a box. And by doing that, we destroy what perfection even is.
So,
We don't even have the ability to imagine what perfection is.
but isn't it like just being in rhythm? Or,
I think it's more like being complete in your awareness of who you are, which you don't have a clue as to who you are in terms of knowing who you are in relationship to the Father, knowing who He is, or it is.
is that not the same thing as being in rhythm? I mean,
No. You can,
Okay.
you can be in
Okay.
rhythm, right now you can be in rhythm,
yeah,
but not be completely aware of who you are.
okay.
So when you are in rhythm or in balance, it's easier to get closer to that awareness.
Right.
It's easier for that awareness to fill you with the harmonious relationship you have built inside yourself, or you have created inside yourself.
Okay.
So anyway, and since the beginning of the cycle to now, we can see how we have progressed and diverted from that original natural sense of who we were into something that we have attempted to define ourselves to be out of our own sense of what we think we should be. But our own sense of what we think we should be is based in an imperfect understanding from the beginning of the cycle. Therefore, as we went through time and it began to build on itself, it got more and more off mark. So what the 21st is representative of, as we talked about before, is a return to the beginning, so that we can finally understand what it means to allow perfection to even influence our experience. It's not something that we define, it's something that we prepare a ground for so that we can experience it. So it comes to us from our own source, not out of us as something we attempt to create. So we got Atlantis and all that, what that represented in terms of where we were in balance with ourselves. And I just mentioned the pineal gland. So our pineal gland at the beginning of the cycle was more active than it ever has been in terms of a collective level. And it still is active, and debating how much I actually want to get into it, but essentially that is where the initial point source of light comes, and then we try to interpret it now. And we have to try to interpret it now because we have our ability to just see what it is has been greatly reduced. So now we have to go through all this process of going through all these interpretations and I don't understand and all that stuff. In the beginning, dreams were much clearer. Dreams were not what we usually experience them to be now. When you slept, you had full conscious awareness of yourself in other realms. As opposed to now, it comes through filters and all these symbols and all that. That's just a result of all the stuff that's been built up on top of that original natural awareness of who we were that has distorted our vision. But closer to the beginning, we didn't have that. And that's related to also why we didn't actually write anything down. Because if your memory is perfect, writing is unnecessary. that too, because the Egyptians have a particular deity, but it's not a deity in the sense that we really think of it. They have a symbol, a mythological figure who introduced writing. And that's Tehuti, or Thoth, or Thoth, however you pronounce it. But anyway, that was the introduction of a system that would allow us to remember what it is we were going to forget. Because they knew that humanity as a whole was falling into a state of disrepair, of sleep. And there had to be something in place that would allow us to trace our path back. And that thing was writing. The whole concept that you couldn't remember something as you had experienced it did not even exist until that began to show up in our experience as a result of the changing atmosphere of energy that was taking place.
Well, but the very nature of thought in the natural, it is when you set it down, it puts a boundary around it. There's some things that words that are not that we can't express based on what our thoughts really are. But there are no words for it, and so what we end up doing is limiting the thought just by the very nature of trying to write it down in the finite way, the most definitive finite way that we have, which is still leaves a lot to be, a lot that's not shared. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but
no, I think I got you. It's very difficult. Well, actually, it's impossible to intellectually convey a subjective experience. So what that means is, for example, I use the example of love whenever I write and do stuff. So we have been coming up with songs about love, writing about love for thousands of years, yet still we have no definition of it. What does that mean?
right.
When I'm in love, what the heck does that mean? The best you can do is attempt to describe an experience. And in describing it, hope that someone else who hears it can connect to an experience that they have had. And if they can't, they will not understand it. So back in the beginning, when we didn't need writing, we had the ability to interface directly with experience. Because we are sharing a subjective experience, and we can access other people's experience if they allowed it. So all that difficulty with defining and describing wasn't as much a part of it as it is now. Because we were aware of and operated on the level of who and what we actually are.
I don't know if it's useful or not, but what's going through my mind is if the Egyptians anticipated the need and therefore created writing to help catalog whatever, maintain, where do you get the whole significance of the oral tradition? I mean, before you had writing, you had an oral tradition, which was, from everything I understand, quite very vibrant, etc. So, I mean, it seems like there's a sequence. You go from hearing and the way that resonates in your head. I mean, if I had the choice, I'd rather listen to the radio than watch TV. And so it seems like the more you get away from hearing, which resonates inside your head, you get to more external things, which I think visual very much is, except for a few things that just really strike us.
Yes, that's the oral tradition is what preceded writing.
Yeah.
So it is like one step closer to that time period. And that's why it resonates more with us if we actually did it. But does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Well, yeah, I guess that's my point.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's the same thing. It's by you hearing, you still see it.
Not the same way.
Not the same way.
Not the same way. You don't believe me? Go watch TV
And
then
I'm
go
not
listen to the
talking
radio.
about the physical see.
Watch TV for a week, listen to the radio for a week, read books for a week.
You still
very-
see it. Now,
But you see it different.
you see, yeah, you see it different, but you still see it.
But don't we always say, when I read the book, I didn't see that actor playing that part in the movie? So that's telling you there's something. The question isn't whether you're seeing it. I think the question is whether you feel more fully connected to it. And then if you add the fact that in more native cultures, the groups were smaller, and I think the storytellers tended to be elderly people who had that parental, there was an emotional love relationship. All that added a more dynamic into the storytelling and the hearing of it. And then the storytelling was repeating myths to repeat sort of quote-unquote truths that are otherwise difficult to explain. And why do we consider an author a great author? Because they can use words in a way that kind of take us back in that direction, I think. And that's why poetry
Yeah, I
is,
think y'all saying the same thing.
yeah.
And you know why I say that too? Because I think about when Jesus said, I see what my father say or see. I don't want to
It's
knock
an
it out.
internal seeing and
Yeah.
an internal knowing.
Yeah,
Above and beyond the physical. is what
and that's
you
why I say you see, but then
It's different.
it's the way. Yeah,
See, I see that Nick is talking about a period when, I think I get this, a period when there was no need for storytelling, there was no need for writing, because we experienced the same thing. All of us were a part of the same experience. But then, as we began to move away from the source in terms of our awareness, it was necessary for storytelling. And then
Right.
when we began to move further away in terms of our awareness, we had to write it. It was time for writing. The hieroglyphics were after the storytelling, so that there would be a record that leads us back, because it was being lost in the stories.
Because we didn't have tape recorders.
Well,
The writing came before the tape recorder. No, I'm serious. Imagine if the technology had been reversed, right?
Well, it's true. I mean, look, we don't remember phone numbers anymore now because
Right.
we've got them all in our phones.
Yeah, so we,
But what are we
Lose them a
losing in
couple
our
times,
heads
just don't
because we're
remember.
not remembering those numbers anymore?
Oh, we just can't find
we
the
are.
lose
See, all of that is like when you sit around a fire and hear a story, you have to engage your own imagination.
Yeah.
Much more so than even when you read a book. And when you read a book, you have to do it way much more so than when you watch TV.
Yeah.
And when you are engaging your imagination, you are tapping into those godlike abilities and a certain degree of them.
but
So, yeah.
TV does not allow you to use your imagination. TV tells you what to imagine.
It's very didactic. Yeah. Didactic.
does.
One
Yeah.
direction. That's why I talk back to the TV.
That's okay.
And I am not the only one in this
No, you're
room.
not. That's all right.
At least I
Talk
hope
back
not,
to the
because the
TV.
rest of you then are dumb. I mean, it's natural. You want a conversation, right? But I think that's probably also after sitting around the campfire, even when you're kids and then telling ghost stories or whatever, there's a richness in that shared experience that there isn't. Why do we have book clubs now? People get together and talk about the same book. People get together and read the book out loud, right? Where there's all those vestiges of that, making it a richer connection.
This great purpose, this task cannot be completed like on a solely individual level. We have to do it individually so that we can be able to do it collectively. Like it's all of us have to be a part of it, and I think when we are together, it's much easier to feel how it produces life. And brings you closer to the experience of what life is. And what we are doing, and those people in the earth who have always attempted to keep the chain unbroken from that first time, at the beginning of the era, is to be that one or two people amongst the majority who have enough of an influence so as to help create that life experience, that life-giving experience. To facilitate it and to make sure nobody forgets how to recreate it. So, we have all these abilities, but, and this is where we start talking about like, okay, all these people had all these abilities, so why then would the majority of people, or the majority of them even, fall out of that state? Why? It's because they didn't yet know anything else. So it was not something to be avoided necessarily, even though some of them knew it was, in terms of the majority. When you operate on instinct, and what most of the people back then and today do is operate on instinct, you have no choice but to go wherever it takes you. You have no choice but to respond to its influence. So, instinctually even back then, we were as gods. Operating because that's just how we were. So even the people who are doing the equivalent of what we're doing now, back then, were consciously aware of who and what they were. But most people were not. They just were. Yeah, I'll just leave it. So, as the atmosphere of energy changed, as the planet moved to a different place in space, as the stars changed their configuration, all this energy changed. And so people had no choice but to respond to it because they were still operating on a somewhat instinctual level. So even though they were instinctually aware of their connection, because it was instinct, because it was something that was not yet consciously mastered, they changed with it. Not all of them, though, because there were those, just like I said, who were attempting to and had consciously mastered it, and there still are. But most people changed with the times. So, what we see as a result of that is the succession of these different cultures and different civilizations. So, moving from Atlantis, anyway, let's move to Africa and Egypt. And it's a little bit, I don't want to make it sound too complicated. Like, all this isn't perfectly in succession. Remnants of everything are still here. But anyway, so in Africa and Egypt, we have the beginnings of, instead of operating from the center point, from where the initial influx of light comes, it moves to the right brain in terms of how it is expressed in the majority of people. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it follows the pattern of initial inspiration, which is the point source of light, to our right brain, which is the creative intuition side of us, which catches or perceives that light first, because it has not yet divided it for the purpose of trying to define it, which happens in the left brain. So civilization, culture, then as a whole, or amongst the people who are driving this process forward, moved into an awareness of themselves that had most of its, that was mostly centered, was mostly in the right brain, in the creative, in the intuition, in the more feminine characteristics when we normally think of that.
But can you, my sense when it goes off center like that, is that could would you then have the creation of superstition? Because when I think of some very basic African cultures, as much as there might be that sense of, and it's not peculiar to Africa, that's just what I'm saying, now you have, it's a distortion of a way, so something like superstition can be, to me, an extension of that. Even if the original understanding was more positive than negative, you're more vulnerable. Voodoo, same. You're more vulnerable to the negative, going off in the negative aspect, so to speak, I would think.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I wrote about all that stuff in terms of what you actually need on my website. But yeah, I'm going to talk about that as well. Because you can go crazy in whatever aspects of craziness, whatever range of the crazy spectrum you fall onto, you can go crazy in that way.
Yeah.
So Europeans went insane in the intellectual, logical way. Africans went insane in the intuitive, creative way.
Right.
Interesting.
Never the twain.
Because those are just the aspects of our total self that those cultures and those groups of people represented or emerged out of and expressed to the full. Because all aspects of the self have to be expressed in some way, and those are the groups of people who did that. But anyway.
And then if I connect those two dots dangerously, if I understand what more recent brain research suggests, the left side has a tendency to be very to want to dominate. Just in the same sense, you could classically think the male wants to dominate female kind of thing. So this female has to be much more subtle to maintain a balance or dominate the left. So you could translate that into something like the European culture, much smaller in numbers, the way they viewed the world, being able to dominate the more at mercy others who didn't translate things. So what word do I want to use? Aggressively, etc., etc. Right?
That's exactly right. So, yeah, the Chinese invented gunpowder, but the Europeans used that to make guns.
Actually, the Chinese made guns, but very simple guns.
They had gone crazy. That was how that was expressed. If that makes sense. So, anyway, I don't mean to say everybody is losing their minds. Everybody's kind of losing their minds, but it's a little more gradual than that.
No, but it explains how Europeans could show up in the New World. The natives living there could see their difficulties and want to share what they know about that. The Europeans then rationalize that as some sort of acquiescence to their dominance, and then then they had the good fortune to have chicken pox and the flu, and suddenly now this was all God's will. That kind of rationalization coming out of the extreme use or base being in the left side versus the right. So they didn't have a chance, so to speak. Anyway, okay.
When you look at the extremes, in between that, I still see that as when we talked about racism this time, it was not really, has nothing to do with what we call racism, but it's all spiritual. If you look at the Chinese, yes, they did invent the gunpowder, but they were also feminine in their thought, intuitive. But there was a mixture of the two, logic and being intuitive. And then it goes to from there, it goes to the extreme of the left brain. From the right brain in between that, it's a mixture of the two, but both of them are degenerating into something less than what they were designed to be. Am I making sense?
My sense of the Asian mind, I don't know why, when you say Oriental, why not? Why couldn't it be Middle Eastern? But anyway, there's more of a history of balance, although they still had, even Confucius was taking things in the direction of being more left brain, right?
Yeah.
Interpreting things as rules and that sort of thing. But even in the manifestation of martial arts, they were done in a very both brain kind of approach. So you had Kung Fu as a very artistic but lethal, ultimately lethal. So you had that combination. I mean, maybe that's a
And that's
silly
what I'm talking
analogy, but yeah.
Yeah, that
But
combination.
nothing was that subtle in the West, so to speak. It was-
Right.
And yeah, some of what we're talking about is difficult because we're kind of talking about defining critical mass at that point. It can't be defined, but when you look at it on a whole, you can sort of describe it. So when we talk about different cultures, within those cultures, there are all kinds of variation,
Yeah.
but on average, as a whole, they express certain things.
Right.
So anyway, what was I to say? So Africa and Egypt, and then from there it begins to move into the modern era. But in Africa, we still had all of the knowledge that was just translated in a different way through the right brain as opposed to direct vision. And because of that, it was still very much so in the beginning, something that promoted growth and was still a strong connection back to the original source. And over time, as we move further and further down the line, it begins to get more complicated, more ritual for the sake of ritual that no one really remembers its real purpose. Now that we just do it because we should do it and because we think it does such and such, as opposed to the consciousness that it was meant to generate, or the awareness that it was meant to generate in the beginning, which is why any and all that stuff ever happened in the first place. I'll get more specific about like Egypt and all that stuff because that has more relevance to what we would call the modern era that we're living in. But in Africa, you have all these different deities, all these representations of aspects of consciousness and intelligence. And when they were first created, they knew that that's what they were. But therein sort of lies the danger of this whole experiment that we're in, or this whole journey that we're in. Because even though we knew in the beginning what we were talking about, we forgot. So we began worshiping things as opposed to recognizing what those symbols were reminding us about that are aspects of ourselves. So that whole mental de-evolution takes place throughout all religion. Eventually it starts out close to the source of light, and as time goes on, as our egos gain more influence, as we forget, as a result of the atmosphere of energy that we exist in, it devolves into mindlessness. And yeah, anyway. So, yeah, I'll come back to that in a second though, but I kind of want to just, if I haven't gone too far, I want to stay on the way in which our minds developed. So, as we get to the right brain, we usually associate the right brain characteristics with the feminine. The reality is men and women both have a left and right brain. Obviously, we both have those things, but we both gravitate towards either group of aspects based on who we are as a whole. So masculine more so has an affinity with what the left brain is, because masculinity is more so a product of the left brain. Femininity, the other side. But we both have full access to both of those parts of ourselves. And it is our responsibility to learn how to bring those two parts of ourselves into balance. So in terms of our ability to influence the globe, or everyone, that directly relates to our external relationships to other people. So how males and females relate on an external level within small groups will affect the balance between masculine and feminine aspects of ourselves in the large group. Internally, we have both. But whatever one we find ourselves to be, or whatever combination of male and female we are, that relates to our responsibility in terms of what types of energies we are here to correct and to bring back into balance. So if I'm male now, that's because I'm here to fix maleness. And if you're female now, you're here to fix femaleness. If you are both male and female, you are here to fix what that is. And be that energy in the earth.
Hold on a minute.
So,
Was it the third one? That's okay, we'll have a constitutional amendment, and we'll put it there.
Okay, you said to be the male, and then you said the female. And what was the third thing? The third?
Male and female.
Hermaphrodite.
Okay.
right.
I just wanted to make sure I was thinking on the same line you were. Okay.
We have all these these things that were put in us in terms of our immediate reaction to things that we don't understand. So,
I got a question.
yeah.
Hallelujah.
So, aren't we all, what'd you say, how you pronounce it? Hermaphrodites? Because, and the reason why I said that is because we all are male and female, and
We're not a physical manifestation.
We're all frogs. That's
Yeah.
right. We're just frogs.
It's not a physical manifestation.
I know, and I'm
It's like a range, though. I mean, we all have both hormones. We
Yes.
all have the left and the right side of the brain. Some people just
The one is more
are a little
dominant.
bit closer to the center
Yeah.
than the rest of us.
so a
Hermaphrodite.
hermaphrodite.
I'm not sure that's that's a fair label to put on that.
Well, yeah.
That tends to be
Yeah.
more sexual and
Oh,
And we look at it physically because that's
Yeah.
just the only way we remember how to look at
Yeah.
stuff anyway. But yes, spiritually we are, this understanding of ourselves as male and female has more to do with a physical characteristic.
Nick,
As
let me remind you of something.
so we're all frogs.
We talked about this once before, that both organs were a manifestation of balance. But we don't recognize it for what it is because it looks different than what we are.
okay, so my question is that they're balanced? Is that what you're
no,
saying?
No. They're here to bring balance.
Okay, all right. That's what I was trying to get, but okay, they're here to bring
Like you here to femaleness,
right
they're here to do that, to bring balance.
for book.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, as this whole process sort of took human beings into a more right-brained awareness, just like we were talking about, eventually we got confused and jumbled up in that experience. So in the right brain way that gets confused is we don't question the spirits anymore. We don't try to understand their purpose and their intention and whatever that it is that whatever energies we come into contact with internally, what they're actually for, and where they came from. We just do it. So that's why in Africa, the original connection to the source still exists, but the majority of it is not done with awareness of that purpose, to connect to the source. It's done because not necessarily that it still works, but I want to say a vast majority it doesn't work. We just do it because we've done it, they've done it for thousands of years, and at some point in the past they knew it worked, except now they just do it because they don't know anything else.
It's more ritualistic.
Yeah. And ritual has only ever actually been a way to
Tom, we lost you. You're frozen.
What is it now?
Maybe his internet connection might have cut.
Rainy, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I'm gonna hang up and try and call everybody back.
Okay.
Would Nick know that? Or is he just talking off and
Let's hope not.
it's like you on the phone? You're 5 minutes into your conversation. Wait a minute, what's going on? I don't hear the breathing.
Rainier's gone.
Yeah.
Hi, Rainier.
Bye.
We're still waiting on Nick, I guess.
He went somewhere.
Okay. Probably lost his internet.
Bathroom break.
Oh, we got you. We got that on tape. Nick's the problem.
Yes. Okay, we good then.
All right, Rainier, one more time.
His power went out. So,
In Washington?
so we done for the day?
Oh, in his house.
Tomorrow must have hit a pole.
Hmm?
Said the power's out.
Okay. He was not at the place where he wanted to finish, but his power's out, so we don't have a choice.
Does he have Skype on his phone?
No.
That's a louder.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see you this
Oh,
weekend.
I'll ask you about that.
Okay.
I was gonna ask you about it.
Let everybody know.
Wait.
Hello.
Hi, Rainier. Nick lost power, so we're gonna wrap up for the day.
Okay. All right. Well, I will see y'all later.
Good morning.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Bye.
Where is it evening?
Bye.
Okay, bye. People from Europe on the line?
The light of truth that we are and the truth of light that we are asks us to know that there is no beginning or end. There just is.